My name's Noel Edmonds. My day starts generally at about 5:30, according to whether or not I'm going to wash my hair. I have to be in Broadcasting House at about 6. I only see a couple of people in the morning, a commissionaire, collect my newspapers, and then a little bit later on, I see the engineer who works on the programme.
Morning. Morning. Cup of tea.
Oh, I see.
That makes a rather strange start to the day,
Okay.
in the sense that at 7 o'clock there's a couple of million people on the radio. Once in the studio, I have to get out a programme box which contains the records for that day's programme. It also has got the mail in it. There's a tremendous amount of work which is done by the producer and the secretary. They do all the work for the main sort of material in the show, the choosing of the records, the getting of the records sorted out. We have to do a few checks, but apart from that, the whole thing starts bang on 7 o'clock.
Coming up for you in 30 seconds from now, 247 sounds, courtesy of Radio 1 and Noel Edmonds. Meanwhile, on 1500 metres long wave and stereo will be 8. It'll be Terry Wogan right after the 7 o'clock news. A lot of good music this morning. Hope you've enjoyed it. Colin Berry, on behalf of producer Francis Line, saying have a good day. Look forward to being with you tomorrow. Bye-bye now.
Tuesday.
A very good morning.
Radio 1.
Well, I hope we find you fit and well on this Tuesday morning. And in view of the fact it is a Tuesday, it's your opportunity to have a little bit of a choose. What do you fancy?
The Admiralty needs a large number of fishermen, especially enginemen and stokers, to form the crews of additional minesweeping and anti-submarine vessels. Application should be made to the nearest registrar, Royal Naval Reserve, who will be found at the Mercantile Marine Office or Customs House.
When I joined it in 1924, the BBC had only been in existence then for 2 years. And it was in 1924 that they sought for qualification, I think, was somebody who had, an education which would enable him to speak what they considered to be good English. And secondly was a chap who'd had some sort of experience in the past as a young man under discipline, which public schools and universities gave, because they didn't expect him to be original. They didn't expect him to have good ideas.
It is a good idea to put it all together as you go. I mean, this record is coming to an end. I've had a card, which literally I've just pulled out of the mail. Somebody reckons they saw me in Wolverhampton, and I'm just going to do a silly thing about, well, I wasn't in Wolverhampton, but I'm going to actually pay them to keep quiet about the fact, a bit of bribery and corruption. And I've got a sound effect just on a tape here of a till. So I'll have a dip in the till and I've got Money, Money, Money by ABBA. So from one card coming in the mail, you can in fact throw a link together, which isn't the funniest thing in the world, but is radio. Excuse me. Love it, love it, love it. Gladys Knight on the pips, and nobody but you. It's 21 and a half minutes past 7, 7:21 and a half, and a very good morning to Carol Boys of 20 Buttons Farm Road, Penn, Wolverhampton. And Carol says, could you please tell me if you were passing through Wolverhampton Town Centre at approximately 3:45 p.m. on Friday, January the 7th. I was with my mother at the time. She thought she saw you pull up at some traffic lights in a red car just as we were crossing the road. I glanced into the car and the man behind the wheel certainly did bear a strong resemblance to you. You were with a large blonde-haired lady who... Carol, do you think we could come to some financial arrangement about this? If you could just keep that quiet. A fiver for the negatives? Thank God. 7:22, 22 minutes past 7, and talking of money.
There was no radio, you see, in broadcasting until the war, before 10:15 in the morning. It started off with the daily service, and then was followed by the shipping forecast, which you had to read and at dictation speed. And that was the start of the day's broadcasting. So you didn't have to attract a large number of people at dawn parade and getting up and going to work. That didn't exist at all. There wasn't anything like that at all.
Timing is very, very important. I mean, not just because the breakfast programme, people want accurate time checks, and as many of them as possible, but in the actual presentation, it's important to get the time right. And one thing, the speed of these grams, although they are very good, can alter. So what I'm trying to do now is time this record. This is not going out in the air. I'm timing this to get the intro before he actually starts singing. And that time is critical because I want to be able to put this record under the Greenwich time signal. Right. So that's 15 seconds, that record. And I want to let that go 15 seconds before it's exactly 8 o'clock. And hopefully the last pip will come and he will then start singing. Hopefully. And it tends to work. Sometimes. I've also got to read a weather forecast as well. So that's an added complication. Okay, I'm gonna... Love it, love it, love it. That's Paul Anka and O'Dyer Coates and Make It Up to Me. It'll be mostly cloudy with outbreaks of rain or snow spreading from the west a little bit later. The snow, chiefly on hills, will be rather substantial, actually. Could be quite a bit of snow around. And a segification for a Tuesday morning to make your knees curl up with sheer exuberance. And with a bit of luck, he will sing on the last pip. You can clap now if you want. The favourite trick, having done that, is then to pick up the record. The sheer thrill of having got it right is to pick up the record that's playing. And I've done that before. I mean, that's as bad as the pilot missing the runway.
Timing of programs was pretty vague in those days. Nothing like what it is today, nothing like as accurate. You had various means of filling up between gaps. We had a thing called a reproducing piano. We weren't allowed to say piano, it was advertising. Reproducing piano, which you put rolls onto, and you had to put these beastly rolls in and then announce them, and then they would go start banging away, and all the keys would be whistling up and down, and you banged away like mad in the studio. And they were always a bit troublesome. Sometimes they went wrong, and there was very great difficulty with these beastly rolls. We had one upright and one grand. And if you took a roll from the upright and put it onto the grand, it didn't play at all. It used to make loud noises, and that was all. But one incident I remember very well was the chief announcer who was in the studio, and he went up to go in Studio 8 in Savoy Hill, and he went up to fill up an interval with a roll like this, and he announced it as study by Chopin or something, and he'd started off, and I was in the announcer's room listening, with the loudspeaker permanently on, and suddenly it stopped. There was a lot of sort of odd noises going on in the studio, sort of shuffling and breathing and Lord knows what, and I thought, has he been taken ill? What's happened? And I waited about a minute, nothing happened, so I then shot out of the room and went up to the studio to see what had happened, and I found him leaning right over the piano and waving at me, summoning me to his elbow. So I went up to him and I looked at him and I whispered to him, the microphone was still on, and he pointed when I buzzed out the studio. So I went and buzzed out the studio, which was the other side of the room, and he was still bending over the piano. And what had happened was that he'd bent over the piano and his tie had got caught in the roll and was wrapped up firmly in the roll of music. And he couldn't move and he couldn't get into the buzzer.
The point about this style of radio is you're doing so many different jobs, because years ago the BBC would operate with a couple of tape operators. I'll just take that LP off, that's the one that I played before. Set up the next record. You'd have probably a couple of Grams operators as well. But as you can see, that's the Radio 1 DJ, the top 40 disc jockey of today, has to actually do the whole manoeuvre himself and think about when the Gram's coming in. He doesn't signal for the music. I select a couple of cartridges. These are taped jingles, because I've got a thing coming up called the School Report. And that's an opening jingle with a bit of music. And that's just an a cappella, which just says Noel Edmonds School Report and sings it. I've got some backing music over here, which I play under me. And at the same time, I'm doing the announcer's job, because I'm actually going to do the reading of the letters. So probably in the old days, there's about 6 or 7 people involved in that kind of manoeuvre.
The whole control of the studio, microphones and everything, was done entirely by the engineering division in their control room. The announcer could only give a signal to the controller by pressing a buzzer, and then the engineers would take control of it and take the necessary action. And this went on for, right up to the war. And of course, putting on records at that time is really a sort of, prehistoric joke nowadays, because you had, originally when I'd first joined the BBC, you had this massive, great meat-safe microphone, a great thing on a blue top to it and on 4 legs, you wheeled it about the studio. And your gramophone, and it was a gramophone, which you wound by hand, a clockwork machine. It had a horn on the top of it, or some later terms had sort of pleated silk or something. And you had a sound box, And you put a fibre needle into the sound box, and you put the needle down, and then you let the record play. And you had to wheel the microphone up to the loudspeaker of the gramophone.
Don't give up on us, baby. Don't make that seem right.
Yes, quite. Actually playing records at the wrong speed, you see, can give you a terrible thrill sometimes. Quite a nice way of exercising some form of censorship is if a record was really bad. It's a downer to actually say it on the air, but it's quite nice just to flick it out of gear. And it just very gradually dies with it.
We weren't allowed to express any opinion about the music. We could announce the name of the music, composer, who was performing it, the make of the record, and the number of the record. And that was all. I remember one occasion which created quite a turmoil in the hierarchy of the BBC. We thought it was rather amusing. A great announcer, during the war it was, Bruce Belfridge, never liked getting up very early in the morning. And we had to play gramophone records during the war. We had to play them at 6:30 in the morning. And the records were supplied by the gramophone department. The gramophone department would give us the records to play. He played one of the record. I can't remember the name of the tune, but I know it was, the performer was Bix Beiderbecke, who I think is a trombone player. And he announced this and played it. It was about 6:30 in the morning. And then he went to the microphone and he said, "I'm supposed to play you the other side of that record, but at this time in the morning it's a great deal too loud. I'm not going to." And this was heavily dropped on. How dare he say this? It's an insult to Bix Beiderbecke. It's an insult to the listener. It wasn't his job to say whether the thing was too loud or too soft. It's his job to play it, and that was it. And that's how the announcers had to do it.
We've got about 1.5 minutes now, studio.
Right, coming to camera 2, stand by Noel. And take 2 and cue Noel.
It's very, very important, I think, to have a visual side to the radio. I've no doubt that the breakfast programme became a lot more popular when I started doing television work, and since Swap Shop, the figures have improved on the breakfast show. And I think it's because people are aware of what you look like, and the familiarity of an individual. You know you can trust him to come into your house, and also you can visualise him as well.
No announcer was allowed to have his name mentioned, his photograph taken, or anything at all. He was in purely an anonymous voice which broadcast on the BBC. In 1929, in fact, I've got a cutting from a paper, which is a very old paper, it's no longer in existence, with an article which is about the future of the announcer. And they have published in there a little photograph headed "The 5 London Announcers." And this was a sort of joke, because nobody knew what they looked like, and this was his idea of what they should look like. And then it wasn't until some years later, in 1932, that the Daily Express got what it called a scoop. On its front page, published the 5 photographs of the announcers at that time who existed in studios in Savoy Hill. After the Express article, the names of the announcers were still not given on the air, and it wasn't until 1940 that they became named in news bulletins particularly, and really only, and the reason for it was that the corporation and I think the country was frightened that with the German invasion of France, and they were only across the channel, that the Germans were expected to try and imitate broadcasting on our wavelength and give false information to the public.
Stay out of the way, please.
Disc jockeys became cult figures when they started meeting a lot of the people whose music they were playing. They were seen to be with them on programmes like Top of the Pops and seen to be photographed with them at record presentations and things. You can earn a lot of money outside by doing shop openings and generally using the name and the face. And I have a number of regular sort of outside activities that I do.
One thing we must ask, please don't push, because otherwise we can't get anything sorted out. And there are some very young kids down the front, and I don't want anyone to get hurt this afternoon. So please, can I ask you if
when you go out and do a PA, as we say, or a gig at a store, you never know how it's going to go down. And you're picked up maybe at the airport or picked up from your house by car, taken down to the store. And just before you get there, you think, crumbs, what will happen if nobody's turned up?
I've got to take my jacket off. Oh!
It can go wrong when You either feel a bit too embarrassed to push the fact that there could be a big crowd. You don't like to keep saying that just in case there isn't. But it can also go wrong if people are, well, they don't realise about the cult jock, the personality jock, and they don't realise what some kids would do just to be near you, just to talk to you.
Anybody want a record? Have a record.
Outside activities were strictly barred to the announcer. He was purely the representative of the BBC. He mustn't get involved in any commercial work outside the BBC at all. There were one or two exceptions to it, but it was very, very, very strictly limited. You had to ask permission, whatever it was. You got an offer to do something, and the reason that you were asked to do them was not because of the personality of today's disc jockeys. It wasn't because you were personality in that respect. It was because you had experience of talking into a microphone and readings dropped in front of you. And you would save them studio time by being a professional at the job. That's why they asked us.
It's 8:30, and here's Robin Boyle.
In Australia, huge rescue operations underway on the outskirts of Sydney after what's feared to have been the...
It could be a terrible downer, actually, the news during this sort of programme, when all the bombs were going off and the Northern Ireland thing was very current. It's very difficult then to pick a programme up afterwards without running the risk of being criticised for being flippant and not caring enough. I mean, news, I think, is the biggest problem about the breakfast programme, because we have a 2-minute bulletin, whereas the rest of the day is a 1-minute bulletin. So he talks away now, and I have to hope that the last item's not too grim.
Servicemen sank after a collision with a freighter.
From the very earliest days of the BBC until the war, 1939, no news bulletins went out at all before 6:15, unless they were of world-shaking nature. That is to say, the disaster of the R101 or the King's death. Those sort of those national and great world importance. Otherwise, news bulletins as such never went out until 6:15 in the evening. And this was written into the charter. I think it was done because of the pressure from the press, who thought that the news bulletins of the BBC would stop the sales of newspapers, which of course is rubbish, but that's what they thought.
We get all the papers in the morning, and I think particularly with the breakfast programme, it's rather nice to mention things that appear in newspapers, so people tend to be reading them at home. And I only quote funny little things like the cat there that was bitten by the mouse. I think they're silly little things, and I think it's got a strength, certainly for the paper it's got a strength. People are about to go out and maybe pick up the Daily Mirror and they'll look at that thing and think, oh yeah, Noel Edmonds mentioned that this morning. It's sort of quite a reciprocal thing. I wouldn't class it as advertising in a true commercial sense.
Advertising was absolutely taboo. I mean, no question of advertising of any sort. I mean, even generic terms like Rolls-Royce weren't permitted, tabloid wasn't permitted, all these things weren't permitted because they were trade names. But some people used to try and get away with it, and I remember Gillian Potter, that great comedian. This is Gillian Potter speaking to you in English. Good evening, England. He used to start off his broadcast. And one day in his particular little piece he was doing, he suddenly said, all the world's a stage, and all the men and women in it merely... But then I mustn't mention one brand of cigarettes without mentioning all the others. And this, of course, he got clean away with.
Sometimes it's very nice to say something a bit naughty, because everyone likes a good sort of rib tickle. One of the little tricks is quite often to make up a fictitious name and address and blame it on a listener. Now, that doesn't work if you've gone too far, because there will then be an inquiry as to who sent it in and whatever, and why did you read it out anyway. But that avoids you actually getting into trouble with the listener as such, thinking, oh, wasn't he rude to say that? I mean, I had an absolutely gorgeous one where a woman sent me a letter where we were talking about embarrassing things on the programme. She sent me this letter saying about her little boy who, whilst there was a glazier in the house washing his hands upstairs in the bathroom, her little boy nipped upstairs, and the next thing she heard was her son saying, all right, remember the 3 things, trousers down, winky out, and hold still. And I did, in fact, put that off for one day, because I wasn't sure that winky was a Radio 1 word, certainly not at 9:15 in the morning. Everybody at Radio 1 looked at me and said, good heavens, of course that's all right, you're talking about a little boy.
Reeve's great theory, you see, was that never put out anything on the air if you know that it is going to shock people in their own homes. That's quite wrong to do it. You wouldn't have anything to have a sort of startling nature. So people accepted it as auntie, like Auntie Times. It was ran on these happy little tram lines and was quite safe. The children could listen to it, and Grandma could listen to it, and everybody could safely listen to it. They were never going to be shocked with bad language or dirty stories or fatuous remarks. I mean, it was perfectly safe home entertainment.
With these sort of mics these days, you can do all sorts of great effects by just sort of moving past it. If you want to give the impression of somebody actually coming into the room, you can sort of come back from here. Or you can do outrageous things with it. We're not trained, but after a while you get used to how much you can pop, you know, how sibilant you can get without causing drafts and things. Oh, the record's finishing. I'll show you one thing that you can do, which is really a no-no in some respects. Good morning, Sutherland Brothers and Quiver at 21 minutes before 9, 21 to 9. And Mrs. Scott has written to me from High Street, Riddings in Derbyshire and says, I saw a picture of you recently with half your beard missing. Have you really shaved it off? No, Pauline. Have a listen. That's me beard. It's still there. This is Boney M. Very bony.
She's crazy like a fool.
I hate to think what anyone in engineering would say about me rubbing my chin over a microphone.
One has to remember, of course, in those days, you see, that microphones as such were the private property of the BBC. I suppose the armed services had them to a certain extent, but I mean, nobody else had them in their homes. There were no tape recorders, because they didn't exist until after the war. There were no form of using a microphone yourself, public address, that sort of thing. So nobody knew anything about a microphone. But knowing that it was covering a large part of the country, they thought that the great thing was to talk very loudly into it. And so people used to get in the studio and shout into the thing, and you had to calm them down. And then, of course, was the funk of people who were accustomed, say, particularly people who were accustomed to public speaking, politicians even, archbishops and so on, and people who talk in churches, when they could hear their own voice or get a reaction, at any rate, to what they were saying from a visible audience. When they found themselves tucked into a heavily draped studio with one cyclopean eye of a red lamp gazing at them and a microphone hanging in front of them and dead silence all around them, it frightened the living daylights out of them. And I'm not surprised, because it was a pretty frightening experience. And, of course, the BBC made things much more difficult by sticking onto the table in front of a speaker a notice in large letters which said, if you cough or rustle your papers, you will deafen millions of listeners. Because at that time, of course, the listeners were only wearing headphones, no loudspeakers.
17 minutes before 9, and that's Boney M, number 23 in our chart, and Daddy Cool. Just one final thing.
You couldn't go in grey flannels or T-shirts or any of those sort of things, anoraks and that sort of business. You had to wear a suit, collar and tie and a suit. And you mustn't have shoes which were worn down at the heel. There was an announcer once who was sent for by the controller. Said he'd walked down the passage behind the announcer and he saw that his heels were worn down. He used to have those repaired at once. It was sloppy and unpleasant to look at, and he must be respectably dressed.
Lovely stuff. Don't cry for me, Argentina. And that's Julie Covington. It's exactly 9 o'clock on Radio 1. There we go.
The keys.
Yes, you can plug them into the transmitter and get through to the 9 to 12 cupboard.
They don't fit, these ones.
And they?
No, you got the wrong ones, eh?
No, I'm sure they're the right ones, aren't they?
Oh, well.
Try the one, try the large, the
The
long...
large one
The
there.
long one.
Ah, that's got it.
Well done.
Lovely.
Good luck.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Stand by, take 6.
The golden hour. Tony Blackburn, remember.
Best of luck, studio.
1960.
Remember this one from Freddie Cannon. Thank you very much, Noel, for the last couple of hours.
Always turn off after me name check.
Nowadays, you've got this massive stuff pouring over the air. I mean, transistor sets in cars, transistor sets on the beaches, transistor sets in the garden. Workmen who come and work in your house have a transistor set on. All this is going on all the time, this noise. I don't happen to listen to it. I don't like the noise it makes. But that's only a personal opinion. I think it's inevitable, and I think for the demand of the public it's probably quite right. But don't ask me to listen to it and enjoy it. I can't. I think the fatuous remarks made by disc jockeys, sometimes I'm sorry that I heard what they said. Most of the time I don't hear it. When I do, I'm rather sorry I heard what they said. I think it's rubbish. But then it's what people like, so they're entitled to it. But if you would like to call me a fuddy-duddy and an old-fashioned character, it's simply because I don't understand it. I wasn't brought up to that sort of a world of broadcasting.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Cheers.